Hello everyone, it's Mrs. Briskin here. Today we're going to learn about the skull in perspective in 3 different views. We're going to learn about the skull in the frontal view, 3/4 view, and the profile, also known as the side view. But to get started, we're going to focus on the frontal view. Okay, here is the frontal view. So when we're looking at a skull in a frontal view, there's a few things to take note of. First off, we want to question how many eye sockets we see, how much of the nasal cavity we see, meaning do we see 2 full halves of the nasal cavity or do we see just a portion of it? And we'll get into that a little later. And how much of the teeth or mouth do we see? Do we see half? Do we see the whole thing? Do we see 3/4 of it? So these are the questions that we're going to answer because these are the visual cues that actually tell us what view we're looking at. So for starters, when we're looking at a frontal view, the question is whether or not the skull in its entirety is symmetrical or asymmetrical. So symmetrical means that you're able to slice the skull in half vertically, right down the middle, and that would mean that both halves are perfectly equal, they're identical on both sides. So when we do that, and let's try this over here. Okay, so we have some of the answers on screen, which is good. You should look at those. Okay, so when we're looking at the front, this is the frontal view of the skull. I'm going to add a line that divides it in half. And when we look at it, you can see that both halves of the skull are perfectly equal, which means that it is symmetrical on both sides. So that's the first thing to really make note of with a full frontal view skull. Okay, the second thing that we're going to pay attention to, as I mentioned, is how many eye sockets do you see? Now, if this was a full flesh face, we would say, how many eyes do you see? So in this case, we see 2 eye sockets. And also, we see both halves of the nasal cavity. And if this was a fleshed face, that means that you would see both halves of the bridge of the nose and the nostrils and the tip and the whole thing, right? And then we also see perfectly equal on both sides. We see the full scope of the teeth, or if it was a fleshed face, it would be the mouth, but everything is divided in half perfectly. Okay, so that's the first thing to make note of. The next question is proportions. So what are proportions? Proportions are where everything is in relation to each other on the skull. So if we go to draw the skull to make sure that everything's accurate, we want to make sure that if we're drawing the eye sockets that in relation to, let's say, the nasal cavity, they make sense. Like the eye sockets wouldn't be all the way up here on the forehead, the cranium area. And the nose wouldn't be way down here, the nasal cavity. That would just look really funny and strange. So how do we know where to place all of these characteristics, all of these features? So the question is, how far down, we'll start with the eye sockets. That's always the best place to start. How far down are they from the top of the skull to the chin? Are they 1/4 of the way down? Are they halfway down? Let's see what you think. So, okay, a lot of people tend to automatically think that it's actually 1/4 of the way down from the top of the skull. But the truth is that's because a lot of people perceive the top of the skull as the hairline. Like if you're looking at a fully fleshed face, that's what they think the top of the head is, but it's not. So if we took the hairline away and you look at the top of the skull, it's way up here, and then the chin, your eye sockets are actually halfway down. So we want to create a guideline right there. So there's our guideline. It's about halfway down from the top of the skull to the chin. And you can see that in my notes right here. Okay, so then we have to look at the next feature on the face, which if it's a fleshed face, it's the nose. If it's a skull, it's going to be the nasal cavity. So the nasal cavity, if we can compare it to a shape, I think one of the best shapes to compare it to, some people like to say a triangle. I like to say an upside down heart because it does curve very much like a heart at the bottom. And so when we're actually looking at the proportions of the nasal cavity, we're really trying to say, like, where does it line up? And we're actually putting a line right at the base of the nasal cavity where that rounded heart is. And if it was a fleshed face, it would be like just the base of the nose where the nostrils are. Okay, so the question is, how far down from the eye sockets to the chin is the nasal cavity? Is it a quarter of the way? Is it halfway down? So we're going to question this again. And if you guessed halfway, you are correct. So here's a guideline for the nasal cavity. It's right at the base, so between the eye sockets and the chin, it's approximately halfway down. All right, you might have noticed a pattern by now that it's all about halves, okay? I call it the law of halves. So you'll notice from the start, there was a vertical line that literally divided our skull in half evenly and perfectly. Then the eye sockets were halfway down from the top of the skull to the base of the chin. And then between the eye sockets and the chin, the nasal cavity, the base of it is halfway down. So if I ask you about how far down between the base of the nasal cavity and the chin is the teeth, then the answer would be halfway down again. So here is a guideline for the teeth. And it really represents that line where the two rows of teeth meet together. And if it's a fleshed face, it would be the separation between the two lips. Or if a person is smiling, you could still say it's the separation where the two teeth meet. Okay? So when we go to do our drawing of the skull or even of a fleshed face, we're going to put these guidelines in as a reference point to make sure that everything is lining up where it needs to be, proportionally in relation to each other. There's two more lines that we're missing. So I'm going to put up a vertical line that actually this line is going to divide one half of the skull exactly in half. So why am I doing that? Because it's pointing out yet another proportion. That's kind of interesting. And we also have to have one on the other side as well. So you'll notice if you look at the purple lines that we have areas where they intersect with some of the horizontal lines. So the one to pay attention to the most at first is where this vertical line, remember it's the half of one half of a skull, intersects with the eye socket. So you notice it's almost like X marks the spot, or like you could call it a plus sign. Why is this important where it intersects? Because you'll notice that it is exactly central in the eye socket. This would also represent the exact center of the eyeballs. So if you know where the center of the eye socket or the eyeballs are, then you know exactly where to draw and to place the eyes when you actually go to draw this. If you follow this purple line down, it also represents where the outer corners of the mouth are. It actually lines up just about perfectly. So because this is a skull, you're seeing some more teeth. You're seeing all of the teeth like way back into the gum area. But you have to realize if this was a fully fleshed face and there were skin and muscle on top of this and you saw the lips, those outer corners would actually line up perfectly with the center of the eye. So these are proportions that are really good to know, and it's really interesting to see how it all works. But just remember, it's the law of halves. That's the easiest way to plan out all of your proportion lines. These are really guidelines. Okay, so we're going to move on. That was the frontal view. And the next view that we're going to look at is a 3/4 view. Okay, so it seems like, this one seems a bit more complicated, but the truth is the law of halves remains the same, and I'll show you in just a minute. But there's a few things that we do need to point out in a 3/4 view that is a bit different from the frontal view. Okay, so let's take a look at the 3/4 view together. Okay, here we go. I'm gonna get rid of these lines so we can start fresh. Okay, here we go. So I'm going to put my vertical center line, which I did on the frontal view before, that divided the skull perfectly in half. That was the center of the skull. In this case, in a 3/4 view, this line, you'll notice it is exactly the center of the skull right here if we just follow it down. But you'll also notice that when I drew this line, I curved it. And the reason for that is because the skull itself, it's not a flat object, it's rounded. There's form, there's dimension to it, so you always want to curve your line with the form of the skull. And so let's pay attention to some of the key things and visual cues that exist in the skull that we actually just learned a moment ago. So the first thing that we want to question is when we have this central line, this dividing line that chops the skull in half in a 3/4 view, are both halves of the skull symmetrical, meaning completely equal? Or did that change in this view? So if you answered that it is not symmetrical, meaning not equal on both sides, and it's actually what's called asymmetrical, then you are correct. Okay, you will notice that there is one half of the skull that is much larger comparatively to the other side. Okay, so you're going to see more of the features on the larger half that's actually closer to the viewer, and we're going to see less of the features on the opposite side because the truth is that skull's turning away from us in space, so we're seeing less of it. So let's question this. In a 3/4 view, how many eye sockets do we see? And the answer would be two eye sockets. However, you'll notice that you see one in its entirety for the most part, but the other eye socket, you might only see a portion of it, or it's going to be distorted because it's turning away from us in space and we're not seeing quite as much of it. But there still are two that you're able to see. And if we look at the nasal cavity, you see one half of the nasal cavity more than the other, like it appears larger than this opposite side. So that's another telltale sign. And then as we move down to the teeth or the mouth, you see one half of those teeth in its entirety. You see a lot more of this half. And if we look at the opposite side, there's only like one, two, three, about three teeth that are visible from this angle because the rest are turned away from us in space. We can't see them on the other side over here. So those are like the key indicators that it's a 3/4 view. You're going to notice that both halves of the face are asymmetrical. You can see two eyes. You can see the nasal cavity, but it's going to be one half is larger than the other. And then the same thing with the teeth. Although you can see a lot of the teeth, you're seeing less of one side than the other. Okay? And when it comes to the proportions of the skull, in terms of like where do we place the eyes, how far down from the top of the skull to the chin, it's all the same. It's still the law of halves. So just to show you, the eye sockets are going to be about halfway down from the top of the skull to the base of the chin. And then when we look at the nasal cavity, it's the same exact thing, where from the eye socket to the chin, it's about halfway down in between. And then when we look at the teeth, once again, the teeth are halfway down from the base of the nasal cavity to the chin. And we don't want to forget our vertical lines that divide the front of the skull, one half in half yet again, because where it intersects on the eyes or the eye sockets, that shows the center of the eyeball or the center of the eye socket. And if we continue down to where the teeth or the mouth are, that would be represent the outer corner of the mouth where the purple and the orange meet. Okay, and there we go. We have our other vertical line that's also dividing it in half once again. So not to confuse anyone on a 3/4 view, but it's still representing the front of the face. What you're seeing over here, this is actually the back of the skull. You're seeing a portion of it, but that's not the front of the face. That's a different side of the head that you're seeing. So we're not counting that when we're doing our vertical line. So just to be clear about that. Okay, so we still have one more view to look at. So we looked at the frontal view, the 3/4 view, and now we are going to look at the profile or side view. Okay, this is another fun one. Okay. So there's some changes that happen in this profile view. Let's just take away some of these lines to start. Okay. So the first thing to observe is how many eyes are we seeing in a profile view? Now, profile or side view means that you're literally seeing the skull from the side, completely turned on the side. And when we look, we're only able to see one eye socket. Remember the other two views we were able to see two? In this particular view, you're only going to see one, and it's going to be distorted. You're not even going to see it in its entirety. It's going to be at a more severe angle. And then we only see 1/2 of the nasal cavity from this angle, and we can only see 1/2 of the teeth or the mouth if it was a fleshed face. Now, let's put up a line that represents the center of the skull. So it's interesting seeing it in this view. This is if someone turned their head and they're looking sideways, and this is representing where the center of the face is, right? And you'll notice that my line is curved, and it's really nice because you can see the true curvature of the face from this angle too. And in terms of their proportions, like where the eye sockets are in relation to the nasal cavity and then the teeth, that did not change even in this view. It's still the law of halves. So if I were to ask you, where do the eye sockets fall from the top of the skull to the chin, it's still going to be halfway down. And then from the eye socket to the chin, how far down does the nasal cavity fall? It's still halfway because we're looking at the base of the nasal cavity. There's my nasal cavity guideline. And then how far down from the base of the nasal cavity to the chin do the teeth go? Well, same thing. It's halfway down in between. And then we're still going to put our vertical line right down the center of the half of the face that we can see. So it's the 1/2 of a half. And you'll see I'm following the curvature, or we call it the contour, of the skull. And as we follow that line down, you see where the purple crisscrosses the pink line. That is representing the center of the eye socket and where you would place an eyeball. And then if we continue down, this is where the outer corner of the mouth or the lips would be, right over here where it's intersecting with the orange. So the law of halves has not changed in all three views. So when we're looking at all of these views, the main thing to remember is the law of halves does not change. Okay, the eyes are always going to be in the same place in relation to the nose and the mouth. It's always going to be halfway down. You always want to start with those eyes, and then from where the eyes to the chin are, that's where halfway down is going to be the base of the nasal cavity, and then halfway down from the nasal cavity to the chin is where your 2 rows of teeth are going to meet. So halfway down. And here we go. So just remember, you will know the difference in what view you're looking at just by questioning a couple things. Is the face perfectly symmetrical? Can it be divided in half perfectly when I put my central guideline down? If that's the case, you know automatically it's a frontal view, and the fact that you could see 2 eye sockets, a full nasal cavity, and the full 2 rows of teeth. You're going to know that it's a 3/4 view, because when you put your central line down the middle, you're going to say, okay, I can see 2 eye sockets. I could see almost the whole nose, but when I divide it in half, it's asymmetrical, not symmetrical. 1/2 of that face is larger than the other, and we're seeing less of the half that's turning away from us in space. And then finally, with your profile view, you are only seeing literally half of that face. You're seeing just 1 eye socket, just 1/2 of the nasal cavity, and just 1/2 of the rows of teeth. Okay, well, I hope that you enjoyed learning about the 3 different views today of the skull. And we will continue with another tutorial where we're going to start to draw the skull in proportion. We're actually going to turn it into a fleshed face, and we'll work with our guidelines that we just learned. So stay tuned for part